Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. It seems that every week there is another infringement on our freedoms and liberties brought on by COVID. And it's all becoming so tiresome for so many Canadians. But beyond just being inconvenienced, many Canadians are actually suffering greatly by some of these impositions. Think about vaccine passports, for example. Some Canadians are being coerced to violate their conscience or medical advice and get the jab. And some are being fired straight up for standing by their rights, leaving them unemployed and for some, unable to provide for their family. The same situation can apply to university staff, professors, and even students across the country. Get the jab or get out is what many are hearing, and with a rare creed or medical commendation being granted. I have personally heard from several university students who were distraught at having to forego their academic year because they were not granted an exemption. And of course, this past November, our federal government introduced vaccine passports to travelers using airports and trains. No vax, no travel for you. But if there are going to be infringements on our charter rights, you can bet there will be legal challenges, and there have been dozens. And you are probably, like me, wondering, well, where do these challenges stand? Are any of them winning? Are they even being heard or just deferred? When will things change? Well, joining me now to give us an update where several of these cases stand, is Marty Moore, staff lawyer with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. Marty, thank you so much for joining me today.
Good to be with you, Tanya.
So again, like many Canadians, I hear about these lawsuits, I hear about these challenges, court challenges, and I feel like they go into the abyss. I don't know what's happening with all of them. So I really hope today on our show we can really delve into these cases to see where things stand. Is there a good shot? What are the chances of things improving or getting worse? So why don't we start with the one that's most recent probably imposed, which is the travel ban. What's going on with the travel ban in Canada?
Yeah, well, the travel ban had been announced and it was delayed slightly to allow for PCR testing. And now just categorically, you have to be vaccinated. That discrimination against a vast segment of the population who cannot be vaccinated for a number of reasons is categorically unacceptable from a constitutional perspective in the Justice Center's view, and we will be challenging that. So the legal documents are being prepared, and I appreciate the stress that you and your viewers would have when legal challenges are filed. Generally, when I'm talking to clients, I'm talking about legal challenges that take matters of years. By the time you get to one court level and off to the next, and so we're dealing here with obviously urgent issues. But in a number of these urgent matters, you actually have to get the evidence before the court and get a full hearing if you have any chance of success on these matters. We have not seen to date in Canada any real relief granted to individuals who press for immediate injunction. And so the sad reality is that these matters do need longer timeframes where expert evidence is brought in, where there's cross-examination and a more fulsome record before the court to hopefully challenge what unfortunately has become the dominant and misinformed narrative around COVID. I was looking at some data. It was an American Gallup study, but it showed people's understanding of COVID, 18, 19, 20 months out, wildly inaccurate, considering that if you're unvaccinated, you have a 50% risk of going to the hospital, for example, when that risk is, down around 1%. The idea that, people of all ages are at serious risk of COVID, and instead of recognizing that this is a challenge that's affecting a lot of elderly people in the vast majority of cases, the public is misinformed, and I think government actions are misinformed, and that misinformation needs to be countered in a court with strong and persuasive evidence, and a court needs to have the time to digest that evidence. And to date, we haven't seen courts actually get in and really digest the information that they're receiving. It seems to be knee-jerk reactions and deference to governments in the court cases that have been filed and processed to date.
You mentioned an interesting thing, and again, I want to get into the court cases when we come back from the commercial break in a few moments, but you mentioned this misinformation or this misunderstanding. You referenced a Gallup poll. And to me, my father survived communism and escaped that. And I recall that, when there's a narrative being continually repeated, people believe it. And, we hear this expression, there's a culture of fear. There's a lot of fear out there. And it sounds like many North Americans live in this fear, and it's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle. Anyhow, we're going to delve into these cases and where they stand in just a few moments. Welcome back. Are you wondering when the end of your civil liberty infringements will be over? When is this happening? Well, joining me now to help us unpack where the court cases are headed is Marty Moore, staff lawyer with the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. Marty, before the break, we were discussing, I guess the latest infringement, if you will, the travel ban. So just so that we understand for our viewers, as it stands now, is it that viewers or unvaccinated citizens who don't have the COVID vaccine cannot access an airport, or is it that they cannot get on a plane? Like, what is the technical situation here?
Well, it's my understanding is that it is for travel. You cannot be on a plane unless you've received a double vaccination, probably soon to be triple. But there's also mandates that are applying to, for example, workers at airports. So that your ability to enter an airport is probably going to be restricted as well. Without being vaccinated. Because
airports are federally, they're under federal jurisdiction under the Ministry of Transportation. What if it was a private airplane? Could I hop on a private airplane, or could a bunch of, say, unvaccinated persons hop on a private airplane and just fly off wherever they want? Or is that considered no-go as well? I know it's still a little gray.
My understanding is that the federal regulations are applying to even those chartered aircraft and those smaller carriers. And so there are some exceptions, for example, for northern residents who cannot access, other means of transportation. So aside from those small exceptions, it's essentially across the board. Air travel, even ferry travel is not permitted to the unvaccinated.
Even a ferry travel. Okay, and you mentioned the word injunction before, and some of our viewers may not be familiar with the legal jargon, but when you said that, injunctions get filed, but they seldom are heard, can you explain what that meant?
Absolutely. Well, when you file a legal case, you're anticipating a long form of discovery. So documents are passed back and forth. Witnesses are cross-examined. There are expert evidence brought in, and that process can take months, even years. And in many court cases, a year would be a standard time for that process. When an injunction application is brought, you're asking the court to, before all of this evidence is heard and digested, we want the court to say, impose an order that we're asking for in the interim. And so really you're asking the court to give it their gut, and maintaining the status quo seems to be the name of the game. But in particularly in regard to COVID, deference to any public health measures or measures from the government is where the courts are landing on these injunction applications. So even if, for example, in regard to the hotel quarantine case that the Justice Center brought, even when the evidence before the court was that, this really isn't effective and it's not helping anyone, and you're imposing substantial costs on people just to exercise their charter right to travel, even in that case, the court's like, well, I'm going to defer to the government on an injunction request.
Oh, gosh. So that means that if in the potentially even near future, quarantine hotels are brought back, this could be a thing? Like they could come back and there's nothing we can do?
Well, thankfully, there are courts of appeal, and we have brought that case to the Court of Appeal and are looking for a hearing shortly. That said, we haven't seen a lot of pushback against government measures. And so, the fears that are being stoked around new variants and really this fear around the unvaccinated are the measures which you could potentially see governments reimposing severe bans. And I think, again, where this all falls down to, in my perspective, is, are these measures rationally justified and minimally impairing of charter rights? And at the end of the day, we have a government and quite frankly, a media narrative that is stoking a lot of irrational fears around unvaccinated individuals. That is not in accord with the latest of science. For example, there's a recent study that came out in the summer, August 2021, and it says clinicians and public health practitioners should consider vaccinated persons who become infected with SARS-CoV-2 to be no less infectious than unvaccinated persons. You've never heard of this study in the mainstream media. Public health officials are not talking about the reality of transmission from vaccinated and unvaccinated, and they're now acting as if only unvaccinated people are a risk to anyone. And the reality is much more complicated than that. COVID knowledge is much more in depth than that. And we are not seeing any of that scientific nuance. What we're seeing is fears being stoked and even discrimination against unvaccinated being promoted, as you recently saw in New Brunswick, where they're saying, yeah, we're going to allow grocery stores, essential services, to prohibit unvaccinated people from accessing.
I want to talk about what's happening in New Brunswick. We've got to cut to commercial break, but we will be right back. Welcome back. We are chatting with Marty Moore, staff lawyer for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, because many of us want to know what's going on with these court cases. So, Marty, we were chatting about some of the more recent infringements on our charter rights. You brought up New Brunswick, and it's true, recently New Brunswick has kind of taken the concept of a vaccine passport up a notch. Share with us how.
They have now allowed businesses and almost encouraged businesses to discriminate against the unvaccinated to an extent we hadn't seen before. Previously, vaccine passports were always, we're only going to put those on, optional events and gatherings. But now New Brunswick's saying that's actually going to affect even grocery stores and essential services, and we're going to openly permit that kind of discrimination against individuals. And, I was speaking on the phone with a client from a First Nations community. Many of the members, the elders in that community, are not vaccinated. And them hearing this, that governments are now permitting even essential groceries to be off limits to the unvaccinated in certain jurisdictions, was utterly shocking and horrifying. And I think as Canadians, to not stand up against this kind of discrimination, again, not justified by the science, but just motivated by misinformed fear and an irrationality. The time to stand is now, and certainly that is an issue that needs to be addressed.
My goodness. I mean, we've seen some of this happening in Europe. Obviously, Australia's always making headlines, but I recall Slovenia, you couldn't go to a local gas station. If you're unvaccinated, you weren't allowed to pump gas. You had to go far, far away from your home for these few select gas stations that would allow the unvaccinated to get gas. Obviously, Austria is now really ratcheting up its mandates. Let's talk about vaccine mandates for workplaces, because this really hits home. The grocery stores does as well, and especially New Brunswick, because most of the grocery stores in New Brunswick, which is my birth province, by the way, God bless New Brunswick, most of the grocery stores are owned by two major chains. So if either of these chains say, we're imposing this mandate, that means they're going to be like a huge percentage of the population unable to access essential food. That to me is shocking. Let's pivot to talk about vax mandates for workplaces. I've heard personally from so many Canadians, they reach out to me, even some friends who've lost their job because they could not violate their conscience, or they had been given medical direction, don't get the jab yet. Hold off, wait and see, maybe later, but don't get it right now. And then they lost their job. Some of these folks have children. They're not just singles. They have a family to support. We've had a show on this before where labor lawyers have said, well, it is the private company's right to be able to impose what they can. Are there court challenges for vaccine passports in workplaces?
Well, there's a number of them in regard to private employers going through the process of labor law and also just employment negotiations, settlements, those kinds of things. And I've talked to labor lawyers about that. In regard to government employers, of course, they don't have the carte blanche to impose restrictions on their employees, and they have to comply with the charter. And so, for example, medical workers in BC, in Alberta, in other provinces are facing that kind of restriction. The Justice Center is close to filing challenges in both British Columbia and Alberta. As you know, in Alberta, there's been a delay in the imposition of this mandate. It was supposed to come in back in early October, then late, and then November, and now it's pushed back out to December 13th, just because of the effect it would have on others. And so those legal challenges will be filed. I understand that Ontario decided not to do it at a provincial level, but many hospitals have in fact gone that way. Quebec
And to be
backed
clear about
off.
Ontario, it's one thing to say, oh, we're not going to bring in our own policy, but nobody's standing up to the businesses that are bringing on these policies. Just because you said, oh, we won't do it, we're going to wash our hands. I mean, you can have your Pontius Pilate moment, but the effect is the same. Businesses are still doing it.
Right. And hospitals are still doing it there too.
Yes.
And so, in regard to those legal challenges, none of them have been adjudicated yet. In Ontario, we brought a challenge to the vaccine passport more generally, which would, again, not apply as much to the employees, but more to the general public that are accessing services and those kinds of things. But yeah, the legal requirements around this will ask, is this a justified workplace requirement? The fact that vaccinated people can transmit as well as unvaccinated people, the fact that unvaccinated people who have pre-existing immunity from a previous COVID infection are actually much less likely to even get a COVID infection, maybe 13 or 27 times, some data suggests, more unlikely to get COVID a second time than a double vaccinated person. This is not accounted for in a single one of these policies that we've seen. And so they are subject to legal challenges. I should note, though.
Okay, can I pause you there? We got to cut to commercial break. Hold that note. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're unpacking a lot of these legal challenges that are happening in Canada, and joining me is Marty Moore, staff lawyer with the Justice Centre. Before the commercial break, Marty, you wanted to add a little note.
Yeah, in regard to the vaccine mandates imposed on employers, imposed by employers on employees, the legal issues around that are not settled. But what we are seeing, and what we saw, for example, in the election campaign, was politicians saying, we're going to prohibit employees from any recourse against employers. And in Saskatchewan, actually, just last week, the government passed a law that said you're not allowed to go back against your employer if they enacted a mandate in good faith. So not did this mandate harm you? Were you harmed by a vaccine you wouldn't have otherwise received? No, you're not allowed to go back against your employer if they implemented any kind of measure, including a vaccine mandate, in good faith. That measure passed in Saskatchewan, of all places. And so the legal issues are now being interjected by the politicians who don't want the legal issues to be sorted out by the courts. They want it to be sorted out by a majority opinion, again, which doesn't seem to be very well informed.
That's horrible. To put it bluntly, that's horrible. Majority opinion should not dictate law. There should be the law, and the courts need to interpret and apply that law. That's quite shocking. Let's pivot for a second. We only have about 3 minutes left. University students, my heart goes out to these students. I've spoken to some even at the brink of suicide, who really, really did not want to violate their conscience and did not want to go through with this job for whatever reason, medical, creed, whatever. Is there any hope for some of these students, or any of these court cases seeing any successes?
Well, not necessarily court cases. We have filed a legal challenge in Ontario, and more to come on behalf of students there. We've written letters, for example, demand letters in Saskatchewan and Alberta to the universities. In Saskatchewan, we saw university, actually not the university, but Saskatchewan Polytechnic, a community college, rescind its vaccine-only policy and now allow for testing, although they've said, we're going to allow for testing, but you have to pay for it, even though it's something that we're imposing on you. And so we're still going to go ahead with legal challenges there. The sad reality is these are government mandates being imposed on individuals, regardless of the risk, most of them very young. And some of them, it may, in fact, according to scientific data, be at more risk from a jab, young males be at more risk from a jab than they are from COVID itself. The Guardian newspaper reported on some studies that said it was 5 times more risk for young males to get a jab than to get COVID. And yet these are the individuals that the university is saying, you're not allowed to get an education, you're not allowed to advance your career and join society unless you get vaccinated. Dealing with really those kind of measures is indeed shocking and should be unconstitutional and illegal, and that's what we're going to be pushing for in the courts.
Okay, we only have a minute and a half left, and I know I brought this up at the beginning of the show. But can we afford to wait? I appreciate that, the system and the court system takes its time, and there's a lot of work that has to be done, and you want to present the perfect case. But when is this going to be over? When will these cases be decided upon? Can we even afford to wait? Can some of these students who, really are at their mental breaking point, can they afford to wait?
Well, certainly, we are doing our best to support students. We're doing our best to support employees. But the reality is, in a democracy like Canada, it was supposed to be a free society. That is certainly in question. Um, we have the democratic process, we have the legal process, and maybe less understood is we have the ability to engage others and change opinions. To date, opinions of the public, which move political opinions, but they also often move judicial opinions. Those opinions are sadly misinformed and are very much against a restoration of freedoms at this point. So I think until we see people's minds open to the science and open to the reality of what's going on, we're not going to see change. And so it's incredibly important for individuals to engage their politicians and even their friends and neighbors about what are the actual facts that are going on here, and look into the science, because again, all of that actually will drive the constitutional question at the end of the day. And those cases are moving forward as fast as we can, but they also have to move forward in a very organized and judicious fashion, because we are fighting against the dominant narrative, which affects members of the bench just like it affects members of the public.
Okay, Marty, we're out of time. Thank you so much for this update. I appreciate it, and good luck with all your work.
Thank you.
Wherever you stand on the issue of vaccine mandates, I think we can all agree that things should be pursued through the court. Now, whether the courts will rule in favor or not of those appellants who are asking for some relief, we'll have to see. But let the courts decide, and let them not be pushed by public opinion. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.